Imagine a world where the idea of goodness is celebrated above all else. A world where being kind, generous, and selfless is seen as the ultimate virtue. But what if I told you that in some ways, being good can actually make you a fool? Dostoevsky, in his novel The Idiot, introduces us to Prince Myshkin, a character who embodies goodness in its purest form. He's kind-hearted, honest, and deeply compassionate. Yet despite these admirable traits, Myshkin is often misunderstood, manipulated, and taken advantage of. This raises the central question: is being good truly a strength, or can it sometimes lead us to weakness and vulnerability? In a society that often values power, dominance, and self-interest, the concept of goodness can be a double-edged sword. On one hand, being good seems like the right way to live, the moral high ground we should all aspire to. But as we see in Myshkin's story, it isn't always enough to be kind. His inherent goodness makes him a target for those who wish to exploit his naivety. This isn't just a flaw in Myshkin's character, but a deeper commentary on human nature. Dostoevsky challenges us to question whether the constant pursuit of goodness can sometimes blind us to the harsh realities of the world. As we dive deeper into Myshkin's journey, we begin to see that his goodness, though pure, is not enough to protect him from the cruelty and deceit of those around him. It raises an uncomfortable thought. Can being too good make you vulnerable? Can we truly live a life of goodness without being taken advantage of? Dostoevsky doesn't offer easy answers, but instead forces us to confront these difficult questions. His work challenges us to reconsider what it means to be truly good in a world that often rewards the opposite. The story of The Idiot asks, can you remain good without becoming a fool? Is it possible to preserve your goodness and still protect yourself from the dangers of the world? In Dostoevsky's The Idiot, the character of Prince Myshkin presents us with a profound paradox. On one hand, he is the epitome of goodness, honest, compassionate, and innocent, but on the other, he is repeatedly taken advantage of and exploited by those around him. This tension between his goodness and the harsh reality of the world around him forms the heart of the novel's exploration into the nature of goodness itself. The question that arises is not just about Myshkin's individual journey, but about the very concept of goodness. Can it really be considered a virtue, or does it sometimes make us weak? Myshkin's innate kindness seems to be a liability in a world filled with selfishness and deceit. Throughout the novel, his desire to help and his unwillingness to judge others often place him in situations where he is misunderstood and mistreated. In one of the most notable examples, Myshkin's pure-hearted attempts to intervene in the lives of others end up making him a target for exploitation. His naivety, which stems from his unshakable goodness, is seen as weakness by the cynical characters around him. They perceive him as an easy mark, someone who is too innocent to protect himself or see the darker motivations of others. This paradoxical relationship between goodness and vulnerability raises a fundamental question. Does goodness, when taken to an extreme, become a kind of moral weakness? Dostoevsky suggests that in a world where power, manipulation, and self-interest often govern human relationships, being good can inadvertently place one at a disadvantage. In his portrayal of Myshkin, the author seems to argue that an excessive focus on goodness can blind a person to the realities of human nature and make them vulnerable to those who exploit this virtue. However, this doesn't mean that Dostoevsky is condemning goodness itself. Instead, he is critiquing the way society and human interactions often twist and distort pure goodness. Myshkin's story is a tragic one, not because his goodness is inherently flawed, but because the world around him fails to understand or appreciate it. His goodness, untainted by cynicism, is a reflection of the moral ideal, but it clashes violently with the corrupted values of the society he inhabits. This clash is what leads to his downfall. The people around him, driven by their own desires and egos, see him as a fool, someone whose innocence makes him easy to manipulate. Dostoevsky's critique is also a reflection of the human tendency to exploit those who are perceived as weaker or more virtuous. In a world that rewards pragmatism and self-interest, the truly good person often finds themselves at odds with others. Myshkin's inability to play the game of power, to engage in the subtle manipulations that govern human interaction, makes him seem out of place in the world. His goodness is not a strategy, it is a way of being. But in a world where strategy and self-assertion are often more valued than genuine virtue, this makes him vulnerable. Yet Dostoevsky does not present Myshkin's story as a simple cautionary tale. Rather, it invites readers to reflect on what goodness truly means. If goodness is simply about behaving in ways that conform to societal expectations or about winning others' approval, then it may indeed be weak. But if goodness is about staying true to one's values and remaining authentic, despite the pressures of a flawed world, then it is a strength in itself, albeit one that requires incredible resilience. Myshkin's tragedy lies in the fact that his goodness is not just misunderstood, it is ultimately punished by a society that cannot comprehend it. In the end, Dostoevsky seems to be telling us that while goodness is not inherently foolish, it can easily be twisted into something that leaves a person vulnerable, especially when it is at odds with the self-serving nature of the world. Goodness, in its purest form, is a powerful force, but it requires a certain awareness of the world's darker forces in order to protect itself from being exploited. The struggle between Myshkin's inherent goodness and the world's cruelty challenges us to reconsider how we define strength and whether it is possible to maintain our virtues without becoming naive or blind to the harsher realities of life. Dostoevsky's portrayal of Prince Myshkin in The Idiot forces us to confront a profound question about human nature. Is goodness, at its core, a form of self-deception? Myshkin's life is a tragic testament to the complexities of virtue, and it raises an unsettling possibility that those who pride themselves on their goodness might, in fact, be hiding deep insecurities. Throughout the novel, Myshkin's inherent goodness is often seen not as a strength, but as a weakness. He is constantly taken advantage of by the people around him, and yet his innocence remains unshaken. This contrast forces us to consider whether goodness, when overemphasized, can sometimes be an illusion, a mask that covers more profound vulnerabilities. At the heart of Myshkin's struggles lies the idea of resentment, a powerful force that Dostoevsky explores in several of his works. Resentment, in its essence, is the feeling of bitterness that arises when one perceives injustice or wrongdoings but lacks the power to retaliate. In Myshkin's case, he does not harbor resentment in the conventional sense, but his innocence becomes a kind of vulnerability. His goodness, rather than being a shield, becomes a burden that leaves him open to exploitation by others who recognize his naivety. His purity is seen as a weakness, and those around him take advantage of it. This dynamic hints at a deeper problem. With the way goodness is perceived, it often lacks the self-assertiveness needed to stand firm in the face of manipulation or malice. The irony of Myshkin's character is that his goodness may not be an expression of strength at all, but rather a reflection of a lack of self-awareness. His kindness, far from being a result of inner strength, seems to arise from a need for validation. Myshkin does not necessarily act out of pure altruism. Rather, his actions are shaped by his deep-seated desire to connect with others and be accepted. His goodness becomes a mask, an identity that he wears to avoid confronting his own fears. and insecurities. Myshkin's idealistic worldview blinds him to the manipulations and deceptions that surround him, leading him to make decisions that ultimately harm him. In this way, his goodness is not an authentic expression of his inner self, but rather a defense mechanism, a way of avoiding the discomfort of facing his own emotional vulnerabilities. This is where Dostoevsky's critique of goodness becomes particularly powerful. He suggests that goodness, when pursued without self-awareness, can be just as much a defense mechanism as any of the darker impulses he explores in his other characters. Myshkin's desire to help others and his refusal to judge them can be seen as a form of self-deception, a way of avoiding the uncomfortable truths about human nature. His goodness is often reactive. He responds to the needs of others without first understanding his own. This makes him susceptible to being manipulated by those who are more aware of their own motives and more willing to exploit his naivety. The danger of this self-deception is that it leads to self-sacrifice without purpose. Myshkin gives so much of himself to others, but in doing so, he loses sight of his own needs and desires. He is so caught up in the role of the good person that he sacrifices his own sense of self in the process. The more he gives, the more he becomes a pawn in the lives of others, ultimately trapped in a cycle of selfless acts that only deepen his own suffering. Dostoevsky presents this as a form of weakness, not because goodness is inherently flawed, but because the lack of self-awareness turns it into a tool for exploitation. In the end, Dostoevsky's portrayal of Myshkin's goodness raises an uncomfortable truth. Goodness, when it is not raw. The tragedy of Prince Myshkin in The Idiot lies not just in his inability to navigate the cruel world around him, but in how his goodness is continually exploited, ultimately leading to his downfall. Dostoevsky's depiction of Myshkin reveals a deeper, more unsettling truth about the nature of goodness. It is not always rewarded, and in fact, it can be a liability in a world driven by power and self-interest. Myshkin's innocence and compassion should be virtues, yet they become his greatest weaknesses, trapping him in a cycle of suffering and exploitation. His story serves as a powerful critique of the idealization of goodness and raises questions about the inherent risks of being too good. At the heart of Myshkin's tragedy is his unwavering belief that goodness, honesty, and sincerity should be enough to foster trust and love. He assumes that others will appreciate his purity, that his kindness will be reciprocated, and that the world will recognize the inherent value of his moral nature. However, Dostoevsky shows that in a world filled with deceit, manipulation, and self-serving individuals, these ideals are often nothing more than naive illusions. Myshkin's inability to protect himself, to see the darker motivations of those around him, leaves him vulnerable to exploitation. His tragic fate underscores a crucial point. Goodness alone is not enough to shield us from the harsh realities of life. This tragic flaw in Myshkin's character is particularly evident in his relationships with other characters. His goodness, rather than drawing others to him, makes him a target for manipulation and abuse. He tries to help people who don't deserve his kindness, believing that his goodness can change them. But instead of inspiring transformation, his pure-hearted efforts are met with indifference or even contempt. Characters like Rogozhin and Nastasia Filipovna, who embody the darker aspects of human nature, see Myshkin as an easy victim, someone they can control and take advantage of. His idealism and willingness to sacrifice himself for others ultimately lead him into a web of deceit and betrayal. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that Myshkin's goodness is not simply an abstract moral quality. It is tied to his very sense of self. He is incapable of standing up for himself or asserting his own needs in a world that demands strength and power. His moral convictions, though admirable, are not enough to protect him in a society that values power over virtue. The world around him is indifferent to his goodness, and his inability to recognize this harsh truth leads him to become a passive observer in his own life. His moral purity, instead of being a source of strength, becomes a weakness, leading him to sacrifice his own happiness and well-being for the sake of others who do not appreciate his sacrifices. What Dostoevsky seems to be suggesting is that goodness without self-awareness is not a strength but a kind of tragic flaw. The idea that good people will always be rewarded is a comforting but ultimately false belief. In fact, it is often the very act of striving for goodness that can lead to suffering and exploitation. Myshkin's tragic fate is a reminder that life does not always reward those who live according to moral ideals. In a world where people are often driven by their own desires and self-interest, goodness alone cannot protect us from harm. This idea is unsettling, especially for those who believe in the inherent goodness of humanity. It challenges the notion that goodness is a virtue that will always be recognized and appreciated. Dostoevsky's work suggests that while goodness is important, it must be balanced with an awareness of the world's darker realities. Myshkin's downfall illustrates that the pursuit of goodness without a strong sense of self and without the ability to assert oneself can lead to tragedy. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of living a life defined solely by the desire to be good, without considering the complexities of human nature and the ways in which others might exploit our vulnerabilities. In the end, the tragedy of Myshkin is not just a commentary on the failure of goodness in a corrupt world, but on the need for a deeper understanding of self. Goodness, when it is not grounded in self-awareness and the ability to protect oneself, becomes a weakness rather than a strength. Dostoevsky's novel challenges us to reconsider the value of goodness and to question whether the pursuit of moral purity can sometimes lead us astray. It's not enough to be good. One must also have the strength to protect that goodness and to navigate the world's complexities without losing oneself in the process. Myshkin's story forces us to reflect on our own beliefs about goodness, and whether in our quest to be virtuous, we too may be exposing ourselves to harm. As we look deeper into Myshkin's character, we begin to see that the true tragedy of his life is not simply his goodness, but his inability to assert himself in the face of manipulation and power struggles. Myshkin's ultimate flaw is not his purity of heart, but his lack of self-assertiveness. In a world where strength is often measured by the ability to stand one's ground and maintain control, Myshkin's passivity is his greatest vulnerability. His kindness, while admirable, leaves him without the tools to navigate the complexities of human nature. He is willing to sacrifice his own desires and needs for others, but in doing so, he leaves himself exposed to the cruelty of the world. The essence of self-assertiveness lies in the ability to maintain one's integrity while engaging with the world. It's about being able to stand firm in one's beliefs without compromising oneself for the sake of others. Myshkin, however, lacks this quality. He is constantly pulled in different directions by the needs of those around him, sacrificing his own desires in the name of kindness. His selflessness, though it may seem virtuous, ultimately leaves him helpless in a world that does not always reciprocate such selflessness. He lacks the inner strength to say no when necessary, to set boundaries, or to protect himself from exploitation. His passivity becomes a tragic cycle where he continually gives of himself, only to be taken advantage of by others. What Myshkin's character reveals is that goodness alone is not enough. It must be coupled with the ability to assert one's own needs and desires. Goodness without self-assertiveness is like a ship without a rudder, drifting aimlessly in a sea of conflicting desires and moral ambiguities. Myshkin's story underscores the importance of finding a balance between being kind to others and maintaining a strong sense of self. He cannot simply exist as a passive participant in the world. He must learn to assert himself, to take control of his own destiny. His tragic fate is not simply the result of his goodness, but of his inability to recognize the importance of self-assertion in a world that demands strength. In this sense, self-assertiveness becomes an antidote to Myshkin's tragic flaw. It is not about abandoning goodness or becoming ruthless, but about recognizing one's own worth and not allowing others to undermine it. To be truly good, one must also be able to protect oneself from exploitation. The ability to say no is as important as the ability to give. Myshkin's failure to recognize this makes him vulnerable, but it also offers us a crucial lesson. Goodness without strength is fragile, and in a world where people are often driven by their own selfish motives, it is easy for the good to be trampled upon. If Myshkin had the capacity to assert himself, to recognize when to step back from situations that were damaging to his well-being, his story might have ended differently. Instead, his passivity leads to his downfall, as he constantly sacrifices his own happiness in the hope of helping others. He is so caught up in the role of the good man that he loses sight of his own needs, becoming a martyr to his own ideals. The lesson here is clear. To be truly good, one must have the strength to prioritize one's own well-being, to set boundaries, and to recognize when others are taking advantage. Myshkin's journey, tragic as it is, teaches us that true strength lies in the balance between goodness and self-assertiveness. Goodness is not about being a doormat or sacrificing one's happiness for the sake of others. True goodness comes from the ability to maintain one's integrity, to protect one's own heart while still being kind and compassionate to others. In a world that often rewards selfishness, Myshkin's innocence is admirable, but it ultimately leaves him exposed. If he had learned the art of self-assertiveness, he could have navigated the complexities of human relationships with greater strength and resilience. In the end, Myshkin's story serves as a cautionary tale for all of us. Goodness, when it is not rooted in self-awareness and the ability to stand firm, can lead to personal destruction. It is not enough to be good. We must also learn to assert our own needs, to protect ourselves from those who would exploit our kindness. Myshkin's tragedy is not just a reflection of his goodness, but of his failure to recognize the importance of balancing virtue with strength. To truly be good, we must be strong enough to protect our own hearts, to assert our boundaries, and to never lose sight of our own worth in a world that often values power over kindness. Dostoevsky's examination of goodness in the idiot goes beyond simply exploring the flaws of Prince Myshkin. It also challenges our very understanding of what it means to be good in a world full of complexities and contradictions. The novel presents an important critique of the idea that goodness is inherently virtuous or noble, particularly when it comes at the expense of personal strength and self-awareness. Dostoevsky seems to suggest that true goodness moves. As we reflect on the life of Prince Myshkin in The Idiot, Dostoevsky leaves us with a profound question: can we be truly good without becoming a fool? Myshkin's story is one of tragic innocence, and through his journey Dostoevsky challenges our traditional ideas of goodness, virtue, and strength. His innocence, though admirable, ultimately exposes him to the harsh realities of the world. However, through Myshkin's suffering, we also learn that true goodness is not about being passive or self-sacrificial to the point of self-destruction. Instead, it is about living with strength, self-awareness, and integrity, while maintaining the courage to assert one's values and protect one's own well-being. Myshkin's story is not merely about a good man being punished for his virtue, It is about the failure to balance goodness with the strength to navigate a complex and often cruel world. Dostoevsky suggests that goodness, when unaccompanied by self-assertiveness, can become a vulnerable ideal, a quality that invites exploitation by those who are more adept at navigating the power structures of society. The tragic flaw in Myshkin's character is that he is so dedicated to his goodness, to the point of sacrificing his own needs and desires for the sake of others, that he loses sight of the importance of self-preservation. His goodness becomes a kind of moral blindness, which blinds him to the darker sides of human nature and makes him an easy target for manipulation and cruelty. However, Dostoevsky does not condemn Myshkin's goodness outright. Rather, the novel urges us to redefine what it means to be good. Goodness, when rooted in self-awareness, is not a weakness, it is a form of strength. True goodness comes from the courage to live authentically, to stand firm in one's convictions, and to act in accordance with one's values, regardless of the pressures or manipulations of the world around us. Myshkin's tragedy lies not in his inherent goodness, but in his failure to assert himself. He cannot defend his own values or set boundaries with others who seek to exploit his kindness, and in doing so, he ends up sacrificing his own well-being. His story teaches us that goodness must be accompanied by the strength to protect oneself and to assert one's identity in the face of a world that often takes advantage of the pure-hearted. One of the most striking lessons of The Idiot is that goodness without self-assertion is fragile. Goodness in its purest form can easily be taken advantage of when it is not grounded in a strong sense of self and the ability to navigate the complexities of human relationships. In a world where power, manipulation, and self-interest often reign, being too good can leave a person exposed and vulnerable. The key, then, is to strike a balance between being kind and compassionate and having the strength to protect oneself from harm. Myshkin's story invites us to consider the importance of boundaries, self-respect, and the ability to say no when necessary. True goodness is not about sacrificing oneself at all costs, but about maintaining one's integrity and values while navigating the complexities of life. In the end, Dostoevsky challenges us to reflect on the nature of goodness in our own lives. Are we, like Myshkin, sacrificing our own well-being for the sake of others, hoping that our kindness will be reciprocated? Are we too focused on being good that we neglect our own needs and desires, leaving ourselves vulnerable to exploitation? The lessons of Myshkin's life remind us that goodness must be balanced with self-assertion, that we must have the strength to protect our own values and identity. To be truly good, we must be able to maintain our integrity while engaging with the world's complexities, never allowing our virtue to become a weakness. Myshkin's story is tragic, but it is also deeply instructive. It teaches us that goodness, when paired with self-awareness, boundaries, and strength, becomes a true virtue, a force that can withstand the trials of life without being taken advantage of. In a world that often rewards self-interest over virtue, Myshkin's story reminds us that true goodness requires both strength and authenticity. It is about living with integrity, protecting oneself from exploitation, and having the courage to be true to one's values, no matter the cost. As we move forward in our own lives, we must ask ourselves, how can we embrace goodness without losing our strength? How can we live authentically in a world that often values power over virtue? And perhaps most importantly, how can we avoid becoming fools in the pursuit of goodness? Myshkin's story, while tragic, offers us the answer. True goodness is not about being passive or self-sacrificial, but about living with strength, self-respect, and the courage to navigate the complexities of life without losing ourselves in the process.